Hello and welcome. In today's video, we embark on another fascinating journey through history, shedding light on a topic that is often overlooked: Asian slavery in colonial Mexico. By the 16th century, Spain had established a vast empire that spanned the Western Hemisphere, extending its influence across the Pacific Ocean to the present-day nation of the Philippines. This expansion brought forth a complex web of interactions and interdependencies, including the flow of people, ideas, and goods between these distant lands. One aspect of this intricate exchange was the enslavement of Asian people in colonial Mexico. While the transatlantic slave trade involving Africans is well known, the presence and experiences of Asian slaves in the Americas are often overlooked or forgotten, so please join me as we explore this lesser-known part of history. The journey of Asian slaves to Mexico began with the Spanish colonization of the Philippines in the late 16th century. Spanish colonizers, seeking to exploit the rich resources of their newly acquired territories, initiated a system known as the Manila galleon trade. This trade route connected Manila in the Philippines to Acapulco in Mexico, facilitating the exchange of goods and people across the vast expanse of the Pacific. In 1570, around 14 or 15 individuals from the Philippines were brought to Mexico as enslaved people, marking one of the earliest arrivals of Asian slaves in the Americas. The Viceroy of Mexico, concerned about the potential negative impact of slavery on Spain's colonization efforts in both the Philippines and Mexico, insisted on sending these enslaved individuals back to the Philippines. However, by 1572, Mexico had already experienced a significant decline in its indigenous population. The indigenous people had suffered greatly from diseases introduced by the Europeans, harsh treatment by the conquistadors, and the demanding labor imposed by the colonists through the repartimiento system, which involved forced labor for specific periods of time. Recognizing the demographic collapse, King Philip II of Spain instructed the new governor of the Philippines to consider the option of importing slaves from Asia to work in Mexico's silver mines. Initially, the plan meant to use Filipino labor in the mines, but in 1574, King Philip II implemented policies aimed at prohibiting the enslavement of native people in the Philippines. This followed similar measures that had been introduced in New Spain several decades earlier. As a result of these policies, the number of Filipino slaves being brought to Mexico significantly declined after 1574. From that point of view, individuals within the Spanish Empire who were categorized as indios or indigenous subjects of the Spanish crown could no longer be enslaved. Filipinos from the islands of Luzon and the Visayas fell under this new classification. However, the enslavement of Filipino Moros or Muslims was still allowed, particularly from the regions not fully under Spanish control, namely Mindanao and Jolo. The Spanish crown justified the enslavement of Muslim Filipinos by labeling them as enemies of the Catholic Church due to their rejection of Christianity. As a result, starting from around 1580, a considerable number of Asian slaves from India and Southeast Asia began to arrive in Acapulco, replacing the diminishing labor force of Mexican indigenous people. Then, in 1597, Philip II issued an order to the governor of the Philippines, prohibiting the transportation of Asian or African slaves to New Spain via the Manila galleons for agricultural or skilled labor purposes. Asian slaves were limited to mining and personal service. Agriculture and skilled labor were designated to indigenous people under the repartimiento system. The only slaves permitted aboard the Manila galleons were personal slaves who served officials and wealthy merchants. The trans-Pacific slave trade never reached the scale of the West African slave trade for a couple of significant reasons. Firstly, there was strong opposition from the Atlantic slave traders, who feared competition from the importation of Asian and African slaves from the Pacific Ocean. These traders called on the Spanish crown to ban slave imports in Acapulco, thus hindering the development of the trans-Pacific slave trade. However, there was also another crucial factor at play. Slaves imported to Mexico from the Pacific were almost 4 times more expensive than those transported via the Atlantic. European East India companies sought to replicate the success of their West Indian counterparts by participating in the slave trade. However, prices for slaves in East Africa were significantly higher due to limited supply compared to West Africa, and competition with the Islamic world for slaves generally led to higher prices. And of course, there was the simple fact that the distance was far greater. Between 1500 and 1850, the European slave trade in East Africa accounted for approximately 1 million slaves, in stark contrast to the nearly 12 million slaves involved in the Atlantic slave trade. While the Portuguese and Dutch did purchase Asian slaves as well from the Coromandel coast and the Malay archipelago, the numbers and profits were relatively limited due to the scarcity of supply. Nonetheless, the Asian slave trade in the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia played a significant role during this time period. The Portuguese engaged in the purchase of children from Chinese merchants in Macau, Japanese slaves from Nagasaki, and individuals from their Indian colonies, particularly along the Malabar coast and the Bay of Bengal. In 1595, we even see that the king of Ayutthaya imported slaves from Cambodia to the Philippines following territorial conquests and conflicts with the Khmer Empire. Additionally, the Spanish captured hundreds of Muslim slaves from Ternate during this period. The majority of Asian and African slaves brought to the Spanish Philippines remained within the archipelago, with a concentration around the Intramuros, the fortified city of the Spanish Manila. By the late 16th century, Spanish Manila had become an important destination for Portuguese slave traders due to the city's consistent demand for slave labor. During the Iberian Union between 1580 and 1640, when Spain and Portugal were under the same monarch, the Portuguese imported thousands of Asian and African slaves to the Philippines. The trade did experience some decline after 1644, when Spain prohibited Portuguese ships from accessing Manila following the dissolution of the Union. However, the trade continued, primarily under the flags of various Asian states sailed by European captains. According to the 1624 census, the slave population in the Intramuros of Manila numbered approximately 1,970 individuals, accounting for roughly one-third of the city's population. Asian slaves were sourced from various parts of Asia. For example, in 1643, a Spanish resident of Manila named Francisco Diaz de Montoya reported owning 3 male slaves and 6 female slaves hailing from China, Java, Ceylon, the Malabar coast, and the Visayan and Jolo regions of the Philippines. During Diego de Salcedo's tenure as governor of the Philippines from 1663 to 1668, records show that he possessed 31 slaves originating from Cambodia, Bengal, Cochin in India, the Malaccas, Jolo, and Mindanao. The majority of Asian slaves in Manila appear to originate from the Portuguese-controlled ports in India, with the Philippines, particularly Jolo and Mindanao, serving as the second major source. Smaller numbers of slaves came from Japan, Java, China, Papua, Borneo, Cambodia, and Ayutthaya during this time. Most Asian slaves imported from the Philippines to New Spain or Mexico worked in major urban areas like Mexico City and Puebla, where they were employed as domestic workers and within textile mills. The Spanish in Mexico regarded Asian slaves as ideal domestic servants. Wealthy families often placed special orders with traders in the Philippines to procure Asian slaves for their households. Compared to African slaves, Asian slaves were perceived as more acculturated to Spanish culture, since many of them had spent months or even years under Portuguese traders, learning about Iberian culture and Christianity. Before embarking on the annual Manila galleon voyages across the Pacific Ocean, they would often spend several months to a year working in Spanish households in Manila before arriving in Mexico. Determining the specific origins of Asian slaves in Mexico based on available documentation is challenging. Slave records rarely provide precise information about the slaves' origins. They typically only indicate where the slaves were purchased, which was usually Manila. Additionally, all Asian slaves were commonly referred to as Chino in documents in everyday language. While Chino is now understood to mean Chinese in modern usage, in the early modern period it generally encompassed all of Asia, including China, Southeast Asia, and India. In colonial Mexico, most people did not possess a comprehensive understanding of Asia and often regarded it as a distant and unfamiliar place, referring to the entire continent as China or China. In some instances, the term Chino simply denoted a faraway location. Later on in the 18th century, the term Chino became associated with individuals of mixed African and native Mexican heritage. Only in modern times did it come to specifically refer to people of the present-day nation of China. There is also little information about Asian slaves within Mexico in general. Presently, there's an estimated 40,000 to 120,000 Asians that arrived in colonial Mexico as slaves during this time or as free persons. This compared to roughly 500,000 Europeans and 250,000 people of African descent. But there is at least one well-documented Asian slave during this time period. Catarina de San Juan's story offers a fascinating glimpse into the lives of many Asian slaves forcibly transported to colonial Mexico. However, she's not widely known outside of Mexico, and very few people in Mexico know her outside of the city of Puebla. Most people in Mexico would know her by the name La China Poblana. As a child, Catarina was reportedly abducted by the Portuguese from Mughal India, with some sources suggesting she was a princess playing on the beach with her younger siblings at the time. The Portuguese took her to their port in Cochin, India, where she eventually found herself in Manila. It is said that she converted to Christianity during her captivity under the Portuguese. While in Manila, she was selected by the Viceroy of New Spain to serve as a domestic slave in his household, and was subsequently boarded on the Manila galleon bound for Acapulco. However, a couple from Puebla offered a significant sum, 4 times the asking price, and she was sold to them instead, ultimately arriving in the city of Puebla, south of Mexico City. Upon the death of the couple, they granted Catarina her freedom through their will. With no money, Catarina began working as a domestic servant in the Jesuit college in Puebla. Over time, she became a beata, a lay religious woman within the Catholic Church. She took a vow of chastity and earned great admiration from the residents of Puebla for her service to the poor and religious humility. Catarina also reportedly experienced frequent visions of Catholic saints, becoming known as a Christian visionary. Following her passing, she was remembered for her deep piety and humility, and she attained a revered status as a local saint. Local Jesuit missionaries and even prominent people within Puebla even positioned the hope to canonize her, but the request was ultimately denied. Nonetheless, in Puebla, she remained a beloved folk saint, and despite the Inquisition's attempts to ban her veneration and destroy her images, these measures proved unsuccessful. To this day, Catarina is still regarded as a religious figure in the city of Puebla. Catarina's image still survives in Mexico today, where she is mostly associated with designing the China Poblana, a national dress within Mexico, although more recent historical data has suggested that it was never actually her who designed it. It was actually a design invented in the late 19th century under the Virreinato and meant to promote Mexican nationalism as well as a sort of way to display the Mexican flag through dress. But nonetheless, the story of Asian slavery and the story of Catarina de San Juan adds an interesting layer to Mexican history that is often overlooked, particularly the contribution of Asian people within colonial Mexico. But that's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching my channel. I appreciate your visit and I hope you found the video enjoyable. If you did enjoy it, please consider liking and subscribing to stay updated with future videos. I look forward to seeing you again in the future. Take care and see you next time.